thank you for all for accommodating me for the timeline. Again, I want to make sure that Lucas and Katie can get over 140 and before it gets nasty, we have storms before it come in. So as we put in the rest of the day, it's not questions. And I'm going to reserve the right to ask the first couple of questions. Then we'll open up the audience. Just for a show of hands, how many folks have questions for just Katie or Lucas? All right, and then how many folks have a question for the rest of the panel? I've got a couple, so we might be wrapping up a little bit earlier today. I've got some other questions that spark my interest, but for the most part, we'll see how it goes. So first off, for all panel members and folks that are online, Dan and Mike, I can't see you from this computer screen. I will do my best to promote you and make sure that we can see what's going on. I'm hoping folks in the audience can show that you're raising your hand or something other or whatnot, but I have your faces now on the TV screen so they can see what's going on. And to my first question, and in no particular order, my first question is for all panelists. We've heard a lot about what you've done, but to get to know you a little bit better on why you're doing what you're doing, I'd like to know why you do what you do, and what's the positive experience that keeps you doing it in this field. So I'm going to start with my left, work my way to my right, and then go on to the panel. So Katie, you're first.
Okay. Why I'm doing what I'm doing and then a positive experience. Okay, so I guess I'm new to ESA. I'm new to ESA research in general. So my background is in water and water rights and kind of irrigation districts. So I think what motivates me is I'm very passionate about helping people get information and data so that they can make better decisions. And those decisions might not look what I would want or what someone else would want, but the idea is that they have the information to make decisions for themselves. So that's something I'm very passionate about. And I would say a lot of my good experiences that keeps me doing what I do are the interactions I have with the students that I teach at Montana State. And then also just like the discussions that I've had with a lot of just water rights holders and chatting with them about why, what they use water for, what they want their future to look like, and, the problems they encounter, and thinking about how can I use that information to make myself a better researcher.
Thanks, Katie. Lucas?
Oh man, let's see. Was you gonna just go to school and be an attorney, make a bunch of money and manage have a big ranch? Or I was gonna be a biologist and manage some attorney's ranch. Now I get to work with Mike, so get a little vicariously to that. But no, I think I walked into an Army Corps of Engineer office one day and said, "Hey, what do y'all do?" And it was a civil works project right next to our family place. I had no idea. I used the lake my whole life, but didn't really know what they did. And the lake manager said, "Hey, if you come back next year, I'll give you a job as park ranger." So my journey started somewhere between wildlife and enforcement kind of side on that, the public dynamic. And I really got interested, honestly, in ARPA, Archaeological Resource Protection Act, and what it took to make a successful felony case all the way through. And get so really weird. It started that prosecutorial thing. But then after that, I just found that it was a niche through college. It kind of blended the best of my desire to work with law and implementation, and then also how to work, with landowners. And I fell into the military, an active land user that's not getting any more land, that has to use that over and over and over again. And the sustainment that they had. And so, I mean, that just drove me and still drives me now. And so it's broadened from just that active military use to working land use to other federal port, any other federal properties, states, things like that. Just being able to help negotiate people through that unknown, kind of thing of, the letters of the law says this, but you can't do this in section 9. But there's no whole section, but the whole thing about what you can do if you can figure out just going through the path. And so that's what I really like. It's something new each time with how to navigate the legal for a good outcome of people. keep the entity doing what they wanted to do, it's private land. DOT.
Thanks, Lucas. Chris?
Well, I think my process kind of started at Port Sam Houston, where Lucas and I were able to transform Camp Bullis and natural resource management approach. From there, I took off to the Air Force, helped put together Joint Base San Antonio, into the Corps of Engineers, and then out to Naval Air Weapons Station, China Lake, where my team of biologists and I actually wrote a 5-year management plan, but now it's the B list, an endangered species located on the base. But we did that in a very collaborative manner with Fish and Wildlife Service, which ended up in the BO actually being very adaptive. So those are the things that actually keep me going and drive me. My time here, I got to go get to meet, a lot of you. I got to come to your meetings. I got to hear and listen to your concerns. And one of the biggest things I wanted to do is, our job as an agency representative is to educate our constituents, whether that be soldiers, our commanders, or water users, through the processes that we utilize so that they can begin to see that and trust us, that now I know the process, I know you're going to follow the process, and you can actually help us help you, so that's kind of what has been my driving force. Small community, born and raised in a small Southwest town in Arkansas, so it was a logging community. So that's it.
Thanks, Chris.
So, I've always, I grew up in rural California, Northern California. Always had an appreciation for agriculture, although I wasn't involved in it. When I got out of college, I went to work in a manufacturing environment for 15 years. The company I worked for moved to Canada, was offered a transfer to Canada, and really wasn't interested in that offer. So I was going to do something in ag, and we had an internship for an operations superintendent in a local irrigation district. I had not interviewed for a job in 15 years. And so, well, worst case, it would be good practice for future interviews. Well, lo and behold, go to the interview, and at the end of the day, I have a job as an operations superintendent for a irrigation district. And it wasn't long after that that the general manager quit. Just when they quit and left, and it was a small district, and they were looking around, and I'm like, well, give me a crack at it. And so I've been at it now almost 20 years, actually 20 years, and a year and a half ago, I actually gave up my position as general manager at North Unit. I was planning to retire, and once I gave up that position, I really started liking the work again. I didn't have to deal with the day-to-day stuff that irrigation district managers have to deal with. I get to work on projects. I attend a lot of events like this and share my experiences. And so that's really what keeps me involved and engaged in the process.
You want to keep the microphone? We're going to go ahead and move to Dan. Dan, can you
Sorry
hear?
about that. Yeah, I can hear you. Yeah. Clicking on the wrong thing there. But I mean, so for me personally, most of my work focuses on land use and land use policy. And I just think that when it comes to land use, there's really no more fundamental way that people interact with the environment. Land is scarce, so we're not making any more of it unless, we're talking about building cities on Mars or something, or, building islands in the sea. And it's also land use change is irreversible, right? So there's a lot that goes into decisions regarding how we use land that are going to impact future generations. And so I guess thinking through and learning more about the effectiveness and maybe unintended consequences of different types of land use policy, and trying to provide that in a way that's accessible for policymakers and the general public is something that I think is important, and enjoy bringing students along for the ride too when I can.
Thanks, Dan. Mike, you got cleanup.
Okay. I grew up in Northwest Wyoming, hunting, fishing, bucking bales in the summertime. And it was the environment that we live in, rely upon, enjoy, that motivated me to go to law school. Didn't particularly want to be a lawyer. I wanted to be more effective as an individual, and advocate for the things that I care about. I ended up working for 30 years for a law firm, so much for best intentions. Sandwiched around a stint working with Fish and Wildlife Service in DC. I believe then, I believe now, that projects like natural gas pipelines, water resource development activities, oil and gas, hydro, can be harmonized with wildlife conservation. I thought at the front end that working with the corporate sector and helping them figure out how to do things right was an avenue I wanted to pursue, and I enjoyed it. Enjoy might be the wrong term. My satisfaction comes from solving problems, and particularly from solving conservation issues and conservation problems that involve people who, before you start working together, didn't think they could talk to each other. And working with them to find a solution that meets the needs of each of them, not necessarily for the same reason, but that supports each of their interests and activities. And then leaving that exercise with a group of people who, like I say, either thought they couldn't or didn't want to talk with each other, or screaming was okay. And leaving them realizing they could work together and they could solve problems themselves down the road. They didn't ever need to see me again. That's what I find the most satisfying.
I think that's honorable. So the next question I have for the panel, and we're going to go from Mike this way this time, and then we'll reverse order on screen. So if you were forced to go through an agency action, section 7A2, over and over and over again to prevent jeopardy, and not seeing recovery of a species, and you had property interests or other interests related to that section 7A2, what would you do to protect your family and your interests?
An HCP. No, not really having spent much time with 782 or the other sections of the ESA. For us, the HCP wasn't the simple answer, but the one that made sense. We could have fought and, probably lost and ended up in years of lawsuits and legal battles, but for us, the HCP was the right path forward.
I agree. I mean, HCP or get the groups together to kind of find out where we can come to an agreement on a solution, present it to the agency, get them on board, get the other stakeholders and tribes, come up with durable, workable solutions that are adaptive and actually serve as the measures of conservation and actually begin to help them recover these species. That's what I would do.
Chris?
I have a loaded question. No comment, mic drop. I wouldn't go through it over and over and over and over again on just to avoid jeopardy on that context. Doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different outcome, and that's the definition of stupidity, but insanity. See, I've seen it happen, watched it happen. This is the only place that it happens. I think that's a good realization that my aperture has been open to. I mean, growing up, I'm trying to tell a long story, take much of my time, but I heard my parents talking about my aunt and uncle and them in Southwest Austin, and They're losing their land, they're taking their land, the service is taking it, we can't do this. And we're talking about a working ranch that they're gonna take, well, developers want it, so-and-so wants it. This period in time called the Warbler Wars, Golden Tree Warbler, they're coming to take it, it's gonna happen, they're gonna lose it. They didn't endure, they bugged out, they sold it, they gave it away for pennies on the dollar, because it's endangered species habitat, moved out east, and then solutions came later on, because people started to think about it differently, different people came in. Funny, didn't realize this till a while back, Mike came in and was doing that stuff, which, you know, testament to his career of different places he'd been, so I mean, I heard that, seen the same thing as a traveled country of red cockaded woodpecker wars. The woodpecker wars, so there's always that thing, so I guess the thing is, you know, have that perseverance and have that ability to continue to work through it. You know, look at outside opportunities, look at, different ways of doing business, different things like that, try and find that collaborative common ground. And quite frankly, don't give up like I saw family members do years ago. You know, they still have that piece of property and it's still, actually it's funny, it's still Warblers and that's a different working ranch because whoever bought it. So they found the compatibility, they stuck it out.
I don't know if I have a good answer to this question. I guess I would just say that I can understand that that would be incredibly frustrating to see that process be repeated over and over. And I have a lot of sympathy for people who are, you know, kind of stuck in that position, but I'll pass it off to the people online to answer.
Mike, to you? You, Mike?
There we go. Usually I depend on Lucas to do that for me. I'd start off with saying it's not section 7A2 that is the root of all evil. Business as usual with 7A2 is. It isn't necessarily. Sometimes it's exactly the right path. But I'd go, you have to take a look, what have we been doing that hasn't worked and why hasn't it done it? 7A2 can certainly be a factor, but it can also be made to work. I think, you know, the key is trying to figure out how to engage with the different interests involved who will either agree with a decision or fight it, and then try to understand what their interests and needs are well enough so that I can point out to them, maybe there's this solution, maybe there's an answer to your problem that looks like this that you haven't thought about. And here's why it might work for you. That solution being one that worked better for me. I did this for, you know, I worked for the big baddies, Southern Nevada Water Authority, Portland General Electric, and others around the country in the 7A2 context. And it is possible to identify approaches that are more broadly acceptable than to a single interest group. And it requires getting to know people and getting to trust them and vice versa. But it can be done. And you know, that would have to be my answer. Keep trying, but try different.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah.
Yeah, this is also kind of hard for me to speak to directly because I don't have a farm. I didn't grow up on one. I mean, it does seem like from what others have shared from their experiences that there is some merit to the HCP approach. I mean, when I think about the ESA and all of the conflict over it, it seems like a lot of that comes down to uncertainty. Uncertainty over how you're going to be regulated, if you're going to be regulated, that sort of thing. And, you know, things like the no surprises clause of the HCP program, or that seems like it's something that could potentially save a lot of headaches in the future if you can get it to work right. But yeah, I would put more stock into what other people are saying here on this one.
Understood, Dan. I'm gonna start with you again, for my next question. I don't expect you to have an answer, but, I'll see if you have a response. So we heard this morning, about the purpose of the ESA, who is and who is not responsible for certain things. But given that we have the ESA, and it appears in writing, the intent of Congress was to recover species. And we're going through section 7 or B72 to evaluate if a federal action creates jeopardy. Where does the responsibility for listed species recovery lie? Again, I know you probably don't have an answer, but I'm gonna start with you.
Well, I mean, no, I don't have a good answer. I mean, I think it's a situation where there needs to be buy-in from both public and private actors. I mean, a large proportion of endangered species are dependent on private land to some degree. So I think it's up to public officials to work with them in order to provide this public good that is ultimately going to be dependent on their land base. But yeah.
Thanks, Dan. Mike, I'm gonna leave you for the end because you're the lawyer in the room. I don't want to get away with the right answer first.
I was going to spend an hour. I was going to spend an hour and a half on that answer and give the rest of the panel a break.
I think I'm gonna just second kind of what Dan said, since this is outside my expertise. But I guess one thing I would say is it's clear that, no matter legally whose responsibility endangered species are, or what the Endangered Species Act says, both public and private have to participate in the recovery process, whether that be through these recovery plans or the fact that, species are on private land, or that they depend on, water rights, for example. And so I think, like Dan said, just having the buy-in of both parties and really focusing on how can we encourage cooperation. And this kind of underscores some of the points that PERC, my company, makes, is that we need to think carefully about the incentives that the ESA creates. And are those incentives aligning private landowners with the recovery of species, since they do play a role, because species are often on private land.
Thank you. I really wanted to go after Mike. I mean, it's the law of the land. Everyone has a requirement to provide something for it, even if it's as simple as not the purposeful violation thereof, as it being a law. As far as in between don't violate it and all the way to recovery, there's so much gray area and so many twists and turns, as y'all have already seen, we've talked about today. But it does fall, on, goes back to my other word, dichotomy of the act. Federal agencies, and there's a brand new legal opinion out, solicitor's opinion that was just delivered to Fish and Wildlife Service a couple of weeks ago. It's about people probably get a hold of it, about what 781 is. Federal agencies have very directed. Thou shalt have a program in 781, a plan. It has to be meaningful. Thou shalt not, jeopardize getting into the native species through your action. Federal agencies have no sway in there. There's lots of sway on how those things are accomplished, though. Same thing on the other side. Those that want to seek voluntary coverage and permitting for Section 10 comes in, whether it's scientific research, banding, or genetic material, all the way to a habitat conservation plan. And there's all kinds of gray area within there. So that's most things, the devil's in the details. But there's pathways through there, and I think that's the meaningful thing there. Is as just a citizen of the United States, we all have some responsibility, but from there, really when it trickles over to the private component is that voluntary side. I kind of tried to get at that earlier, is that voluntary collaboration, that working away. And this is the conservation without conflict thing that I mentioned at our recent summit, is the more we can narrow that gap between that dichotomy, the better it'll be anyways. Why that it was done with the best of intentions. Endangered Species Act, prevent extinction. It was not done to stop water use. It was not done to prohibit development. It was not done to stop industry. It was done to prevent species from becoming extinct. Since then, now we've got 50 years of interpretations. We've got new tools, we've got better tools, we've got lots of examples of what has and hasn't worked. So I think, again, the more we continue to blend that gap with whatever piece that we can bring to it, and even if it is just not the direct violation thereof, I mean, that's something.
Thanks, Lucas. Chris?
The strict reading of the ESA would be saying all federal agencies where the species occur within its footprint, but I agree with what Lucas has said. Everyone else. I mean, I think we all play a role, and we all have a responsibility. The collaborative nature of and cooperative nature of the 7A1 for the federal agencies is very apparent. I mean, we did a 7A1 workshop at JBLM with NIPS. I guess you can ask that question to various federal employees and citizens, and answer might be different, but I think it's everyone. It's gonna be my kids here soon, so I just think it's all of us.
I would have to agree with the others, and really, we're all responsible for recovery of species, whether it's individuals or agencies or other groups. It's really upon all of us to make sure that species are around for kids and grandkids and others. And part of that is working together amongst ourselves to find solutions to the problems. They're not easy to find. They're not always comfortable conversations to have, but you gotta have them, or else we'll be doing the over and over and over again until somebody gives up. The other piece is we really need to stop weaponizing the Endangered Species Act and start using it as a tool to find the solutions and fix the problems. And until, as long as folks are able to use it as a weapon, I don't see a positive path forward with recovery or work towards other species that are on the verge or about to be listed. But, from my experience early on, it was used as a weapon against the irrigation districts. And that really is the sad part of it. Listening to the Nixon tape, I was surprised too that he was maybe a closet environmentalist, but he was also had the foresight to see what was happening and put it in place for a way to maintain our species, not let them go extinct or down that path where we need to get to recovery and to not use the act as a weapon against others.
Thanks, Mike. Mike, I'm putting you on screen again. Give us the real ones.
Okay. Can you hear me? I think I got my mic unmuted. Okay. Well, the ESA was enacted ostensibly on behalf of all of us. Congress's purpose in doing it was to try to preserve what was conceived of as a public good that served us all. That's the basic root for wildlife conservation, and generally it's states that have that responsibility on behalf of their citizens. Nobody's ever regarded wildlife as a free use good, if you will. The federal government, federal agencies have the primary directed responsibility and the only directed responsibility. However, when Congress enacted the statute, it also contemplated, and the ESA itself contemplates, states playing a much more robust role in the conservation of T&E species. And that's where the Section 6 program came from that I think Mike Britton referenced. Fish and Wildlife Service was authorized to provide grant money to support state wildlife conservation programs. That's great. You kind of need Congress to create funding for that. And the dialogue between state wildlife agencies and Fish and Wildlife and others for 30 years has been, we can't do our job because we don't have money to do it. And Congress certainly has not stepped up to date in providing state agencies money to conserve T&E species through the service grant program. The consumptive users of wildlife, hunters and fishers, pay the freight for the state agencies, as I expect everybody on this call knows. But the vast majority of us who enjoy wildlife, who might not hunt or fish, we don't really have a dog in that fight as it's currently administered. So I think you've got to come to terms. The feds, even if they devoted all their efforts to conserving species on their land base or where they control, they can't accomplish it. If you look at various parts of the country, Oregon, Pacific Northwest not being among them, where you have a much higher preponderance of private lands, you can't accomplish species conservation without robust conservation efforts on private lands. So I'd say in that regard, it's the federal agency's job both to do conservation work they can on their landscapes consistent with their missions, and to find ways to incentivize, remove disincentives, and encourage public engagement, public involvement in conservation. The saying that, we're 50 years into the ESA, yeah, we are. And we're 50 years into learning how to weaponize it really well. Mike Britton was right on target with that. That means we also have 50 years of hurt feelings and bad feelings, and we have to overcome those. That's just part of the challenge. We also have to recognize that species have been being impacted by human activities on this continent since the original inhabitants got here, and since we came on, the Indo-European folks came on top of that. The passenger pigeon went extinct in 1920 because people liked fancy hats. Now, that wasn't the federal agency doing it. That was the public and market hunting. The point is, no one entity, no one of us can do the job by ourselves, and no one of us is responsible. Right now, the biggest is solely responsible. Right now, the biggest issue facing wildlife across the country is competition for living space as human activities continue to expand. That may or may not reverse itself, but if you look up and down the Pacific coast, that's where the gnatcatcher went. So I'm afraid it's all of us, either because each person has to decide for themselves if they have a moral or other responsibility to contribute to conservation. That's nobody's right to preach that. But I think each of us does have responsibility to think about, what does wildlife mean to us? And if it means anything to us, are we going to try to do anything about it, no matter how small it might be or otherwise? I know I sound sort of like an evangelist. I promise I'm not. I mean, God, I used to be a lawyer, supposed to be cynical, but that's how I see it. And I don't think, for me, we don't have any choice. End of sermon.
Thanks, Mike. I've got a number of other questions that I preloaded, but in the interest of time, I want to open up questions for the audience. So if I could show of hands, Sam, I think I see your hand up first. Can I get the microphone?
As a project irrigator that is having property taken away on a daily basis from us, and in a spirit of cooperation, we're willing to work with other people, and then wanting the society as a whole to bear the burden of endangered species restoration. How do you feel specifically, Mike, about restoration when the Department of Interior and the Department of Interior Agriculture, has abandoned their role to the Department of Commerce and has allowed NOAA and the Pacific Fisheries Management Council taken the responsibility for restoration and of these fish species, and in the process taken our property directly away. And in that regards, do you think that the Chevron decision from the Supreme Court will have any effect on those decisions made by the agencies?
Sam, that was a very specific question. Mike, I don't know if you're necessarily prepared. If you give me a nod, if you can feel some of that.
I'll respond to some of it, but I was pretty sure he was talking to Mike Britton. No? Okay. Okay. Well, I'll take a swing at some of that. I don't know the specific details, I'm sure, as the person asking the question did. I will say one thing about Chevron. The Chevron decision, when it was handed down, was in support of limiting agency overreach, and it was not an environmental decision. It was set in a very different dynamic. Since then, Chevron has come to symbolize a doctrine under which the judiciary favors whatever you want to call them, liberal interests, whatever you want to, like I say, whatever you want to call them. Chevron at its heart is based on the premise of who's best positioned to understand how Congress might have handled a specific problem that's not addressed in the statute. Is it a judge? Is it the judge's law clerks with their limited experiences, with all respect? Is it an agency that works in that field all the time? Chevron came down on the latter. It's an interpretive doctrine. The one thing I would say is Chevron and the litigation, I believe, are the moral of those stories is beware what you ask for. Because we're all pretty comfortable with agencies making decisions to do things that aren't specifically articulated in a statute when we like what they're doing. And agency use of flexibility in interpreting the statute doesn't go one direction. That's why environmental groups sue as well as industrial groups, private sector. So the flexibility I spoke to, which I think is the heart of opportunities to conserve consistent with the Endangered Species Act, you could find that going away if Chevron is reversed. Smart money says it looks like it will be. I'm not sure everybody who thinks that's a good idea is going to be that happy with it 10 years down the road. Kind of like, I don't like all this regulation, so let's cut their budget. And then all of a sudden, the permits you need take another 5 years to get because the agency doesn't have the workforce. Those kinds of issues are two-edged swords. And I think we just need to be aware of that. I also don't disagree, however, that we as a society don't allocate burdens and obligations equitably among all of the people involved in complex issues. And I think that's really clear. The people who end up paying the piper aren't necessarily the ones who get any of the direct benefit, nor are the people who are perhaps most responsible for causing an impact, the ones who are taken to task to pay for it and fix it. I think that's part of the heart of the question, and it's dead on. All I can say is it's an imperfect system, and you just have to do we collectively have to do the best we can to understand the breadth of the impact of what it is we're asking for and who we're asking to do it, and ask the question whether we're treating them fairly at the same time we're advocating for a position. A lot of times, especially on large landscape issues, the answer is no. I'm afraid that's a fact of life. It's not one I like any more than I think anybody in the audience likes it. About all we can do is to, we talk about little measures like, well, let's internalize the costs of this development activities. And let's make sure the person who's doing it pays all the costs, including the kinds of social costs reflected in pollution control, water quality, wildlife. But the world is so complex to the point we're not very good at doing all of that at once. And I'll toss my hat to anybody who shows me that they can do it. But we got to keep trying. I don't think we have much choice. So that doesn't answer all the question. But that's the best I can do, sitting here right now.
Mike, I don't know if it's appropriate. I know on one of our phone calls, we talked about the differences between how U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has been approaching this issue for years and how NIMS is a recent player or a fairly recent player. I don't know that the Department of Agriculture, the question saying us, Department of Agriculture kind of fits into that. But is that something you would share with that audience or with this audience?
Well, just from a limited perspective, when I started working with the ESA, it was in the late '80s, and the act had been assigned for principal administration, not sole responsibility, to Fish and Wildlife Service and National Marine Fisheries Service. And for a lot of years, the Fish and Wildlife Service wasn't doing all that much in terms of identifying species in need of listing or trying to establish conservation programs. National Marine Fisheries Service was doing almost nothing. If you go back and take a look at the listings chronologically, National Marine Fisheries Service, from my perspective, when I was working for Fish and Wildlife Services, they were sitting very happily on the sidelines, letting Fish and Wildlife Service take the spears. That lasted until folks started paying attention to the anadromous fish and salmonids that have since been listed. And NIPS had a hell of a steep learning curve in front of them. I'll leave it to others who work with that agency all the time to judge whether they've gotten good at it. I would say some people at Fish and Wildlife Service have gotten really good at it, but not everybody. And by good at it, I mean being more, being other than a one-trick pony and focusing on not only the power of the regulator, but the power of the persuader and the need to be able to do both. I don't know where National Marine Fisheries Service sits on that spectrum.
Thanks, Mike. Does anybody else want to take a crack at Sam's question? All right. Another question in the audience. I see more hands. Good.
So I've recently got back into it. The Endangered Species Act is 2 years older than I am. But my family's ranch was one of the first ones that was met to the water sucker. So I've been involved in this for a long time. I stepped away for a while, came back. I had an interesting observation. I wanted to have some people weigh in on the nonprofits, the NGOs that are in this sphere. I went to a very eye-opening meeting about 6 months ago where I sat and listened to a vernacular that made no sense to me as a private landowner talking about my private land. And you talk about this group, the conflict, the bridges, the thing, the group. Yeah. We are all open. We have gone the legal path multiple times. We're open to this. We are having a hard time bringing our agency stakeholders to the table to continue this. And the NGOs are speaking a language that I don't understand. They're funded in a completely backwards way from any investment that's ever been made into natural resources before presently that I can wrap my head around. They seem to be more part of an extension of the agency than some sort of neutral middle ground. And then one last comment, I don't care who answers the question to that. I would think that your problem with easements in the state of Oregon is that those that are running land trusts have an advantageous relationship with private landowners. And unlike in Texas, where they work with private landowners, I think the Oregon land trusts actively try and subvert landowners.
Thanks, Rich. So I'll first look for folks that may want to respond. I'm gonna call on either. All right, I don't see any other panel members that want to take on, so Dan, I'm gonna throw that one direction.
Gene, I might take a swing at the NGO, but I didn't quite understand the question. Are we talking about environmental advocacy NGOs that are often the, litigants forcing listing decisions or trying to change federal land use policy in light of listing, or is it a different NGO behavior and vernacular that's the thrust of the question?
Yeah, I think it's changed. Originally, they were part of the lawsuit. Now they're part of the greater conversation and stakeholders, but they seem to not have that equal third-party standing. Seems to be more of an expenditure of agencies.
Okay. Okay. I think I'm still off. Yeah, I understand what you're speaking to, and it depends on which conservation groups, NGOs you're talking about. The advocacy litigation oriented NGOs, Center for Biodiversity, Western Watersheds Project, Biodiversity Legal Foundation. They have a very decided litigation bent, and their objectives and motivations are related to that tool. Others, I mean, the Nature Conservancy isn't even on that spectrum from my perspective. However, they work with federal agencies all the time. TNC and other land trust organizations rely on and therefore work with federal agencies as a source of funding to pursue their work. And they develop pretty good working relationships. I think you probably could say the same thing with ag advocacy groups that work with the Natural Resource Conservation Service, local extension offices. We have good relationships with the people we spend all of our time with, whose constituents we are and who we expect to respond to us as constituents. It is possible, I think, to develop those kinds of relationships when you're from outside the constituency community, but you got to have time to do it. So you either need really effective representatives in your trade associations or your state organizations, or you have to do it yourself. And when you're actually working, you're working your land or somebody else's for a living, it's hard to have time to do that. So there is an imbalance, I think. Agency personnel who are smart, which in my experience has been most of them, recognize the difference, but it doesn't necessarily feel, I understand it not feeling like a level playing field. If you're in a collective discussion where you have an agency, it's NGO constituents, and they have something to do with your livelihood, when you don't have the time to spend 4 or 5 days a week touching base with them about something. I expect the NGO community would say, we don't have that good a relationship with the state engineer. We wish we had as good a relationship with the state engineer's office as those people in the ag community over there. And they'd probably be right, at least in Wyoming.
Thanks, Mike. Mike, I see you took the microphone. Did you have a response?
Not a response, but more of a comment. I think what we're seeing, or at least what I have experienced, is a shift in cultural and societal values within NGOs and agencies. Back in the day, you could work with tenured senior managers at agencies that were common sense folks. They knew the mission of the organization they worked for. They would often go out on a limb for something or for you, and you don't see that anymore. We have a new generation that, quite honestly, is afraid of their own shadow. They're afraid to pick up the phone and call you. They're afraid to pick up the phone and you're on the other end of it. So it's that's what I've seen, and today I would be afraid to try and start an HCP or other process simply because of the inexperience that is within these agencies, NGOs, and organizations now. It's just it's a whole other world that I honestly probably wouldn't be able to survive in myself. And the other piece I see is NGOs have become more brazen and more litigious. You know, as I mentioned during my presentation, we had an NGO that was a collaborator that sat at our table and we thought they were trying to help us find solutions, but at the end of the day, they were fact gathering. And they actually used some of that information in the court of law against us. So that's more of a comment than an answer, but that's kind of my perspective on the NGOs and where we are today with trying to get things done.
Thanks, Mike. Dan, I promised to get back to you. Your thoughts?
Yeah, so on the easement side of it, I think, I mean, there's certainly an argument to the fact that having good working relationships between land trusts and private landowners is going to be critical to getting landowners to adopt things like easements and to just have better working relationships in general. But I do think that a large part of it does operate through the land market as well. And it's hard to argue without concrete evidence that the UGB policy hasn't had a significant effect on farmland values in the state. So I think ultimately it's probably a combination of many things. And yeah, I probably could have maybe made that a little bit more nuanced in my discussion, but yeah, I think there are several things that could be at work, both things that are easy to measure, or both things that are really hard to measure and things that are really hard, but maybe slightly less hard to measure.
Thanks, Dan. Any other panelists? Lucas?
Something real quick, I guess. Not sure it was observational, but the conservation without conflict one is just relatively young. It's a long-standing idea, but just stood up formally a couple of years ago. You know, waited on COVID, get a new executive director. Literally just had our first summit meeting, and you know, really the goal there is to try and be a you know, and the things we talked about was, you know, be that fiduciary, you know, for all's interest and be on that. But you're gonna have bad actors and everything. You know, that's part of it. And again, when you run in, you know, NGOs, is it the ones that are here? Is it the individuals within? You know, there's all those multitudes of factors. Is there outside NGOs that you might want to bring in or discuss with, things like that? But like Mike mentioned, sometimes just those relationships, you work with who you know, especially in these realms and in arenas. And the other part I was just going to mention, and some of it's just information sharing on. There's absolutely, and I used to oversee what's called ACO, Army Compatible Use Buffer Program, which we'd have to acquire these conservation lands through third parties. I've seen none, so I'm not giving any, you know, plug for or not, but I mean, there are things out there for land trust alliance, different things like that, that show that they're meeting certain standards, they're doing business in certain ways, and there certainly are those out there that are almost predatory in nature. They're just more interested in getting the roll through and getting the funds to support their business model. But they're out there. But I think that's also too is, you know, ask those questions, bring it up, keep asking those questions until someone brings you back an answer of, oh yeah, or check with LTA or something similar to that. What kind of standing do they have? And or is there anyone else in the area that might, you know, be interested in those things? There might be a new land trust or it's expanding area as well. So just throwing that out there, just the information sharing a lot of times can help cross-cut a lot of those issues.
Thanks, Lucas.
Hey, Gene. Gene, I might just second Mike Britton's comment about the lack of experience within the federal workforce. That is a very real issue. Inconsistency in agency response and treatment of particular issues is a real problem. Inconsistency within the agency and inconsistency among the agencies. And it is exacerbated by workforce evolution and devolution. And, you know, I think what it means is you have to be prepared. If you're going to do an HCP, you have to be prepared to coach the folks you're working with within the agencies as to what their policy and regs do and don't allow. And, that's an unfair burden, but if you're, if you're putting in a major project and you don't show the agency how to get to yes, you're not likely to be as successful as you want to be.
That's a good point, Mike. I think that is, something we're going to have a challenge with, as we go this route. So thank you for that. Other questions that we might have in the room? All raised? No. Oh. You can go first.
I guess I had a question for Katie, and I guess you just mentioned you're newer to ESA research, so maybe you point me in the right direction. I think there's a big public perception, not just perception, reality, that oftentimes private land owners are held to a higher standard sometimes than public land managers, whether you're talking about noxious weeds, thinning, or the ESA. So just wondering if you have any data or where to track it down, what % of funding goes towards actually like implementing conservation versus just studying these species? Because it seems like we have a little bit of a paralysis of analysis going on here in the basin, and we're getting a lot of good data on these species, but we need to act on that data. And I know Craig had a study from 2007 when they said, yeah, obviously funding is going to be tied to recovery. So funding is a shortage issue, but yeah, if you have any info on studying these species versus actually implementing conservation practices.
This is, oh, yeah, wait. This is like $1 million question. My colleague Jonathan Wood and I talk a lot about this because in kind of the ESA literature, which I'll back up for a second and just say research on the ESA is really hard. And it's for the reason that I mentioned earlier this morning, which is we don't really have a group of species that is at risk and not covered by the ESA. So we can't really compare how well the ESA is doing because we don't have anything to compare it to. This is the idea that if you're like, another way to put it is if you're looking at, how effective a medicine is, you want to look at someone who's sick and takes the medicine and compare that to someone who's sick. And then see, the difference in those two outcomes is the impact of the policy. And so what you're getting at is, it's not just the quantity of funding that we want to look at, but we want to look at this slice that's, well, how much is actually being implemented? We don't want to know how much is, being paid to build a dam infrastructure. We want to know, well, how much is actually going to on the ground recovery of that species? And this is really hard because those funding numbers kind of group everything together. So right now, Jonathan and I are kind of combing through all of the available funding information and trying to parse that apart and seeing if we can actually get at that estimate so we can kind of do a more robust analysis of what actually contributes to recovery. And the encouraging thing is because of how the field of economics is advancing, we may have ways to kind of look at this like treatment control policy effect group in ways that we weren't able to before. And we certainly will consider this funding element. I don't have a data source to point you to right now, but if you keep checking PERC, I'm sure once the article is out and published, if you want to leave your email, I'm happy to send along whatever work we find so that you can also have that information too.
And it's not like funding is just to the ESA too, like we have the Partners Program, which funds Fish and Wildlife Service on private lands. And that's going to benefit some of these species, but it's not just explicitly for ESA recovery. So
Yeah.
I can see how
It's hard.
hard to tease that out.
It's really hard to tease that out, and I'm optimistic because I love really interesting problems that are messy with data and have lots of confounding variables. But it just means that you have to be really careful, and it takes a little bit of time to kind of parse apart what the actual impact of a regulation is. Do you want to answer that one?
Thanks, Katie. I was going to just ask if anybody else had a response.
Dan might have something to say.
No, he's shaking his head. All right, another question, any other questions? Oh, Mike, did you have a response?
Just throw something out in terms of recovery commitment. I don't think it's a coincidence that historically there has been a lack of focus and concerted effort on recovery. Certainly on, on the part of the federal agencies, because recovery plans are supposed to be a prescription for recovery, but they're not something that Fish and Wildlife Service gets sued over. They're not necessarily things that are uniformly developed that are uniformly robust recommendations for particular species, because they tend to be something of a pain in the butt to write. They are not mandatory. No federal agency, including the service, has to perform activities identified in a recovery plan. The service tries to encourage agencies to do them. So they're a soft part of the ESA that hasn't been spurred on, if you will, through third-party litigation in the same fashion that execution of the listing program has. So it doesn't help any. It's sort of like a generalized online prescription, and some of the plans are very sound, and some of them are just, they aren't necessarily worth the paper they're written on. So it's another set of confounding factors.
Thanks, Mike. Paul, I'll get your question in a second. For folks that are online, if you have questions, please raise your hand and I'll look through those for next set.
Well, my first question is for Mike. You mentioned earlier in your HCP that what's good for fish and what's good for frog is not necessarily the same thing. Sounds like maybe you had coverage for a take of either one in your HCP. Is that correct? I've got some follow-up questions.
Paul, the good sound system should catch you up, so if you just hang right here, you'll catch it.
Okay.
One question at a time.
So that statement was related to the upper Deschutes River and not fish species that were part of our HCP. We have local red band, native trout species in that stretch of the river. And some of the management practices we do now because of the frog doesn't always benefit the fish species. But as far as the listed species, that statement really doesn't apply to those, thank goodness. Because there is one other species that's on the horizon, which Gene didn't mention, was the western ridgeback mussel. And it has a totally opposite water need than what the fish have. So there's going to be some headbutting on who wins that fight on who gets the water event. So that's something that is on the horizon.
So I guess my follow-up isn't necessarily with you, but on that, like Katie said earlier, the ESA is extremely ineffective on actually recovering species. Maybe it's good at preventing extinction, but it's extremely ineffective at recovering it. And we keep talking about the doing the same thing, section 7.2, or with no jeopardy. So if the Fish and Wildlife keeps issuing these plans that say, operating the project this way has no jeopardy, and we keep not recovering any species, I mean, at what point are we kind of, I guess, have we missed like the common sense? Yeah, you're essentially. So at what point, and maybe this is a Mike on the internet question, but at what point is the Bureau, or I mean, is Fish and Wildlife, or anyone who's issuing these NIMS not no jeopardy statements, at what point are they responsible if there is a take, or if they keep doing this and we don't see a recovery, at some point, do they lose credibility? Can we say, hey, maybe you're not the best available science, or how does that work? Because this seems to not pass the common sense test.
Yeah, so Mike, this is again, a very specific question. Kind of directed at you, but I think there's other panel members that might be able to speak to it a little bit. I'll give you the first crack at what you can.
I'm assuming that I'm the mic in question, right?
That is correct.
Yeah. Okay, cool. I told you guys that Lucas was the one that was supposed to get all the hard questions. There's a number of things going on. Yes, the service takes a hit, but the Endangered Species Act takes a hit too. The credibility of the concept takes a hit if it doesn't work. And one thing that I am quite certain of is the Service ES program is dedicated to preservation of that statute and accomplishment of that mission. I don't think they live to regulate. It may feel different from the outside. There's a couple of other things to factor in. One is ESA is not the only federal statute that directs federal agencies to conserve wildlife. National Forest Management Act has very specific conservation requirements for species on lands where the Forest Service has jurisdiction. And lest we forget, the spotted owl, that was not an ESA case. That was a National Forest Management Act case. And the plaintiffs were challenging the Forest Service for not maintaining viable vertebrate populations on their lands. They added in an ESA claim, and the decision came down on that ground. It's not. There's a little broader responsibility programmatically within the federal government than simply looking at the ESA. The BLM has obligations under the Federal Land Policy and Management Act to manage the multiple resource values of the public lands, and those include wildlife. ESA comes into play when those existing conservation programs don't do the job. At least that's the way the statute's written. So there's plenty of responsibility to go around for getting to the circumstances we have. I believe, well, right now, honestly, I'd say the biggest driver within my experience for Fish and Wildlife Service looking for better, more efficient ways to work is coming from the outside. I think DOD's efforts to manage their lands in what I think DOD would agree is a common sense approach is an example of that. The tools that we're trying to develop are aimed at your ability to manage your landscape and habitat values to benefit the species complexes that depend on those lands, not just a single species one. That is not the way the ESA is set up. And one of the things they're trying to figure out there is, can you do it legally and effectively? If you can't, good luck on managing the public lands. Good luck on managing BLM grounds. If we're spending $100 million on sage-grouse recovery, that's just one species. What about the pygmy rabbit? There's just a myriad of species. So I don't think there's any question that we need to figure out how to accomplish species conservation better. I don't think we've gotten the most out of the ESA that is possible, but we can always use more tools. So I'll stop at that.
Mike, Lucas?
Man, where do I start? No, I'm just kidding. Great question. I mean, there's several example species out there. It doesn't end, doesn't it? Look at the whooping crane. It's a great species to look at, started with 20, gets to 200, 250, 300. Big drought, big drought, big flood, big whatever, not enough water, makes it down to, the basin estuaries in Texas, back to 20 of them. Keep going. That the act doesn't give them, to lay responsibility. And also, I think if you did ever say, hey, service, we want you to have full responsibility in recovering this, we wouldn't like the laws that are going to get enacted, because then we are going to be talking about taking of things, more control of things. So I mean, right now, it is really in gun to really involve everyone, even though it's a dichotomous act, but the work to try and get towards that recovery. The service absolutely publishes relatively frequently extinction reports in the Federal Register. Happens all the time. Here's a blanket 3 to 5 species not known to be in the wild for 20 years. Dedicate extinct. No longer needs protection of the act. It happens through all best of intentions, it happens. There's species in much more peril than species we're talking about here. Look at Hawaii, Guam, other locations, narrow endemics is what they're called, little things that only live in this one hillside on this one thing. Take an Army example. There's 20 or 30 of these species. Genia coalensis is the species of vegetation in Hawaii. They got it completely almost back to recovery. They've got it in refugia. They've got it, outplanted. They've got it to 300 plants. They've got it to managed stability. Everything's going great. An unforeseen, unknown rust came in through the ornamental plant trade. The rust decimated it. The only way it stays alive is in a greenhouse getting fungicide monthly on it. Well, Army has to continue to underwrite that, as their federal action. So the question is come up, well, when does it turn to the service? When is enough on this? Is a species worth saving? There's pathways in the act to that. It's all God's stuff. There's no reason to dive deep into that and open up a huge can of worms. It's been utilized. There's Northern Spotted Owl Forest Management Plan. So I'm not saying go those routes. I'm saying the goal is to try that space in the middle. Is continue to move forward, continue to try and find these, new things, different ways to approach it. Is there a science gap? Is it an NGO gap? Is it a funding gap? What are those things that can be done? Is there threshold management? Such as like in the HCP, at certain thresholds, we get to manage ourselves. Below that threshold, we've agreed that we will give of ourselves to maintain that threshold for a species. So there's give and take there. So I'm not, the middle ground is where most species are recovered. And some of them are probably doomed to extinction. It's going to be too little, too late. It happens all the time. Some are going to be a lift unlike you've never seen. Hawaii species, talk about a nightmare consultation, 115 different species on one location in the Pacific Island. That's a hard one. And most of them are plant species and can only go in one watershed because they're so separate, they're so endemic. Well, the story of that is, Hawaiian Islands is the first time, someone, came across landed on the island. First, then people brought rats, then people brought this, people brought the mongoose. So there's these long storied histories on all these locations with all these TNE species. And I hear you loud and clear of when's enough. And we've seen bad actors, we've seen bad publications. I'll give you one more example. At Camp Bullis, there's these karst invertebrates. The karst is like cave and karst ecosystems. Little tiny insects that live in the dark zone of the caves. Talk about trying to get someone to rally around, say, these cave bugs. That's a tough one. Never seen it. Everyone that's ever been found has been killed or put in a jar because it has to go to this scientist to determine it was actually that for Dynegs that was fetal. It happens. So you're doing pseudo-biological surveys. We're surveying they're surveying cave crickets and nutrient inputs, surrogates, these different things. The recovery plan got published and it was drafted. I commented on it, as an agency rep, all stuff. Has to exist in 3 karst faunal areas. So one part of the room, 2 part of the room, 3 part of the room. It only exists on Camp Bullis. That's pavement of Bexar County, pavement of the city of San Antonio. There are no more caves. They published the recovery plan anyways. On unrecoverable species, because maybe those will who's gonna dig up half of San Antonio and turn back to native ecosystem caves? It's not. But there are other pathways, and those are things that have been discussed as maybe it can be precluded for the need. Maybe it's not warranted for listing anymore because it's protected under the conservation, the 7A1 conservation integrated natural resource management plan of the installation. I think that's where Mike's getting at. Is there are these new and different pathways, and there's still evolution of the act, and as you can tell, you got me on one of the good soapbox things like this. But enough is you have to have a unifying statement of the American people. You'd have to go to an almost unknown God squad that hasn't been convened in X number of years. I know Mike's probably got some info there. But really finding that collaboration, getting away from that transactional, and finding those pieces that everyone needs, putting that puzzle together with some of these new ways kind of helps build and blend some of that. But it's frustrating as that. I've sat in the seats that you can't recover that species, don't publish that. It's published anyways. That didn't change my requirement to manage that species. What it did is it allowed us to have a new look at our consultation that says, hey, we're the last game in town, we're the last place on the planet. Service, you really need me more than I need you. So let's sit down and talk about really how we're gonna consult. And one thing we hadn't really talked about is, what are the threats to the species? You know, is it not enough water, is it clean water? Is it, and this is an oil change next to the pave, is it a spill or whatever? So managing threats a lot of times alleviates 80% of the question. Then there's those just hard and fast ones, I guess. But I'll quit rambling. I like to say, for you, it's a great question. And I think that's the one that, you know, gets wrestled with. You're not alone in that question. That's a pretty solid universal.
Thanks, Lucas. Mike, I see you had your hand up. Did anybody else want to tackle that one before I go back to Mike? Mike, take it away.
Okay, just a couple of reactions. If you get into a discussion of the Endangered Species Act with most people, almost anybody that works for the Department of Defense, and you've got a couple of guys sitting in front of you that have a lot of experience with it, they'll probably agree. One of the favorite topics that DoD has is Fish and Wildlife Service always picks on us and requires us to do more than anybody else, public sector, private sector, because we'll talk to them. You know, the federal agencies don't necessarily feel they're getting a lot of love either. The ESA does not contemplate failure. It doesn't anticipate that there are species that cannot be preserved in the wild. That was the basis for the act being described as anti-evolutionary back 30 years ago when I worked for the agency. As we see more and more situations where species simply can't be conserved outside of a refugium or a zoo, I think we'll see a whole nother set of issues coming into play. And that's a topic that nobody that's involved in species conservation really wants to talk about. It's like setting up a business and having no exit strategy in case everything doesn't go right. So, you know, these questions today are sort of probing the next frontiers, which is one of the reasons this is my cop out for all of this. We don't have real good answers for all of them. The other thing I would mention, though, is we're looking at a very small slice of biodiversity when we talk about the Endangered Species Act. If you want to take a look at something that helps put it in context, happy or otherwise, take a look at the Audubon Society's Christmas bird counts. And take a look at what's going on with neotropical migratory songbirds. My favorite is to pick the state bird in whatever state you're in, and look at the declines in reported breeding bird nest survey data over the last 25 years. That picture isn't real pretty either. And those are species that we continue to think of as common. But there are species and wildlife trends going on that are much larger than simply the Endangered Species Act. What does that mean? I guess it can make you, you know, Gene asked us a question, what makes you get up in the morning? That's a question that might lead you to hide under your bed, but that's not a real attractive option.
Thanks, Mike. So in the chat, April Snell with Oregon Water Resource Congress, she writes, a great panel and appreciate the perspective offered today. Is there any additional advice, a positive activity or message that the panelists can offer? And I'm going to start with Katie and Lucas, because I know we're at 3:30 right now, and I want to make sure that I get you out of here on time.
Yeah, we're looking at the snow coming down right out there. I mean, as a researcher, something that excites me are complex problems, and this is the definition of a complex problem. And so I think the thing that I'm looking forward to, and I think, you know, hopefully other researchers are as well, is, you know, we have more access to data. We have new methods that we can investigate this problem with. And hopefully we can continue to find new answers and evaluate this policy to see, you know, where is it working well and where isn't it working well, and what explains when it works well. And I think that will help us, or at least, you know, may help communities understand what may help the ESA look less arbitrary than it might from, you know, the perspective of a landowner.
And I think you're a second. I mean, it really, a lot of the things and ideas that we talked about today and this, that, they're really easy solutions when you're just the DoD. Or when you're doing it in an area that is not so closely tied to livelihood and culture. As some of the conversations that y'all have had and that y'all are having. And so that makes it even tougher, you know, when you're dealing with a very inflexible law that has some really hard and fast things. It's got long history of lawsuits, and it's got everyone on edge and nervous. I mean, it's really hard to try and be positive, but I would tell you, I've seen similar ones before and try and be positive, move forward, look for those next things. When you don't know what the answer is, you don't know what the next agency answer or what the next document's gonna be, things like that. The unknown, hell, that scares anybody, you know, and when it's so closely tied to livelihood and culture. I mean, I can't sympathize, I don't empathize, you know, I can only feel like what that might be. But again, just realize there's good people out there doing good things. The 50th year of the ESA has really opened up a lot of discussions that, you know, I've been lucky enough to call myself, you know, I'll call myself lucky enough to be involved with leaders of Fish and Wildlife Service agencies, leaders of the other federal agencies, different things like that. It's just been, by happenstance, I've been involved. They're rooting for all of us. They're rooting for all the species. They're rooting for each one of these individual cases, the cave and cartridge vertebrates, as much as the working lands, as much as the livelihoods, the fishes, this, that, and the other. So a lot of times it's really hard to see that, you know, be open and positive, you know, when it's so close to the fire. But I would say that, you know, be energized that there are people here that want to support. There's other things, ask the questions. I applaud y'all having symposiums like this because it brings some of that outside discussion, and there's no silver bullet, but maybe there's little nuggets that can help, you know, further make these plans a little bit better, get a little bit more information. A little more of that collaborative versus that transactional or closed door, what's next stuff. So I say that, you know, kind of, you know, the heavy heart is where y'all are at. It's a hard place to be. All consultations are a hard place to be, but, you know, keep your head up, keep moving forward. Because folks don't want to see failure on either, you know, loss of species and or loss of livelihood. You know, in the end, what do we want?
Thanks, Lucas. The question.
Be positive.
Is there any additional advice, a positive activity or message that the panelists can offer?
I think, you know, going back to DoD was kind of eye-opening, like reunion with Lucas in a way to see, it kind of leaving kind of gave me back my sense of why I started what I do. So I would say, like, I agree with everything Lucas has said, keep pushing forward, but also, you know, there's been a lot of litigation in the basin, up and down, you know, over what the words that are contained in the ESA. To be creative and to think of different approaches, I think Lucas kind of brought it up. Look at what it doesn't say. That's that space you can operate in, that creativity that you can generate, those relationships that you can build, you know, with the tribes and others, but don't give up. You know, this basin's worth fighting for, which is why I came. It's why I'm still involved today, working with Gene and others and answering their questions when I can. You know, like Lucas said, we don't want to lose the species, but there's a point where, you know, there's some things that we can't do, and sometimes that's that need. You guys can keep moving the needle here by not giving up.
Some quick advice for my perspective and the experience of the HCP would be if you can get out ahead of a species listing. The Oregon spotted frog process and listing really caught us by surprise, and as a result, we didn't have our own series of studies or work or literature to be able to have an educated conversation with the services on the frog. So, you know, shame on us for that. But having said that, with the status review going on with the Western Ridge mussel, we started work on that once we heard about the status review coming back. And so we've already spent probably 2 years studying the mussel. Where's it at? What's it need? What's the status of it really? And so when, and if it does become listed, which we're assuming it will be, we have the ammunition ready to be able to have those conversations with the services. And sometimes you can contradict or disprove the studies that they've done. And that goes a long way in helping your side of the story versus just accepting the story of somebody else that thinks they have the right story. So my advice would be, if you know a species is listed or is under status review or is potentially going to be on a list within your basin, get out ahead of it and start doing some homework before it actually becomes a listed species.
Thanks, Mike. Dan?
Yeah, so I'd probably just pick up on kind of what Katie was saying. As we have access to more and more kind of large scale data sets, as the methods we have to analyze data improve, as public awareness over things like distinguishing between causality and correlation, as those things continue to improve, I think how much we know is going to increase, and that'll allow us to make more informed decisions down the road. And I think economists are often asked to make predictions about things, and it's usually something that's never happened before. And so it's really hard to make any kind of hard prediction on something that you've never been exposed to before. And so with all this experience we're gaining, just as a society, that's all data that can be used to inform and make better decisions and craft better policy down the road.
Thanks, Dan. Mike, you've got cleanup?
Couple things. Couldn't agree more heartily with Mike Britton's recommendation about get out in front of it. Corollary is spot the problem before somebody else does. Figure out what you need to do to solve it. But beyond that, I understand the question. For those of us that work in the arena, it can sound like we're voicing platitudes, dispassionate, because it isn't our lives that are at stake. But I've seen my neighbors cry over the discovery of listed species on their ranch, and worried about whether their children would have a ranch in their future. So it is a lifestyle issue, and it is a way of life issue, as Lucas voiced. And not enough folks in the professional conservation game really understand that. It's hard to explain it. It's hard for folks who live in cities to understand why a rancher can profess concern for his cattle or her cattle when they're being raised to slaughter. But if you've jerked a calf, you understand what the emotional connection is between that rancher and their livestock, and it's very difficult to explain to folks who have not, at least in my experience. To address the question directly, I'd say find joy in small victories and keep at it. Search for more. I think we've made more progress in species conservation than we think or recognize. When I went to law school in the 70s, the National Environmental Policy Act, EIS, discussion of wildlife impacts of a proposed action was 5 to 10 pages. Think of that. If you look at a NEPA document now, you're probably looking at 10 to 100 times that in some cases. We are paying attention to wildlife conservation societally in a way that we never did historically. Individual landowners did, but not the public at large. And so I think it's hard to quantify how much less we've lost than we could have, right? I mean, Katie, that's a tough metric to to come up with, because we're talking about living outside a regulated environment. But I think we have made progress attitudinally. During Bush 2, Gail Norton was the Secretary of Interior, and she advocated for collaborative conservation, and she was laughed out of the room. The environmental community had no patience for that. Now it's a buzzword. We're all using it. And so I think our attitudes toward not only what's possible, but what we have to do if we want to see what we enjoy now persist. I think that's evolved over time. And I guess we have to keep our heads going against the wall and hope for the better. I think we can get there. As I said at the beginning, I think we're pretty good at solving problems once we recognize them and accept responsibility for trying to solve them. And I think this and other meetings like this, that's what it's all about. So, Gene, I appreciate you bringing folks together. I hope that this has been useful to your endeavors and for everybody in the room.
Thanks, Mike. So I'll return to my opening statements. We have some questions to ask ourselves. What does the vision of the future look like? What can we ponder that's possible? As we analyze what our vision is for the future, what does that future look like? And then I ask, can we analyze if that vision is possible without changing the way that we're in this current cycle of things? I'll leave that as my open-ended question. I would like to thank all of our panelists for attending today. As a token of our appreciation, we had some coins made up. It has Endangered Species Act 50th anniversary on one side, Klamath Irrigation District on the other side. I've got some goodie bags for our panelists as well. And also each one of our panelists, well, before I get to that, every one of you will get one of these coins. As you leave out, make sure you talk to our folks back there. We'll make sure that you get one of these coins to recognize your participation today. And our thanks and gratitude for being part of the educational opportunity. Before our panel members, I'm also going to give them another coin. This particular coin, if you're familiar with the Greek mythology of Sisyphus, was a Greek king that had angered the gods, and in his punishment, he was sent to Hades, and every day he had to push a rock up the hill. At the end of the day, when his pushing was done, the rock would roll back down to the bottom of the hill. In the morning, he was have to start again, and that was his life in hell for eternity. And that's what I feel like. I'm sure Mike feels like that. We've had our conversations before. I know I've talked to Brad and I've talked to others. We feel like that is our life as district managers, pushing this rock uphill every day. At the end of the day, we have to start all over again from scratch a lot of times because something changed. Engraved on this, it says the strongest steel is forged in the fire of a dumpster. That can be said of numerous things here in the Klamath Basin. And I'm not going to put daggers in people's backs. I don't want to put daggers in people's hands. But when we think about that, if we think about how steel is forged, we know we need to heat it up and we need to feed it until it gets the consistency of the strength that we want it. And in my 5 years of working with this and pushing my rock up the hill, I don't know what's getting harder, my head or my heart. I've got a message on the backside that the panelists can read. That's not really important for this group today. But also included in this is a bottle opener to open up your favorite beverage. So when we're done pushing our rock up the hill every day, we can open our favorite beverage and stay hydrated. So thank you very much for everything you do, and thank you for being on.